How's it going, guys? Akira here, and today we are here to celebrate the PlayStation's 30th anniversary in North America. So I'm sure you guys know December of 1994 is PlayStation's 30th anniversary in Japan. That's when the PlayStation originally came out in Japan, of 1994. But in North America, it came out on September 9th, 1995, and we are currently on September 9th, 2025. So it is 30th anniversary of the American release. So I decided to do a cool video, just talking about it, because why not, right? I love to talk to you guys about the PlayStation. And as you can see here, this is the Doko Demo Isio box edition, which is pretty cool. I know I've made a video about this in the past, showing it off to you guys when I got it from Japan. But yeah, it's pretty cool. So yeah, just have it here as a display piece to show you guys. But yeah, what can I say, man? 30 years ago, this console came out in North America. I wasn't alive back then. I was not born until the very trail end of the 90s. So I'd never experienced it and stuff like that, kind of like how 90s kids, they say. But, from stories you hear on YouTube and stories you hear from people older than me, in person and stuff like that, they tell me that at first, they were puzzled. They were like, Sony, what the heck is Sony doing consoles for? Because remember, during the 4th and the 5th generation, the reason why those are called the graveyard generations is because everybody threw their hat in the ring and tried to make a console. And everybody failed except two, Sega and Nintendo, right? Atari threw their hat in the ring with the Jaguar, flopped. Apple, believe it or not, Apple, you're from your iPhone, they made a console called the Apple Pippin, and that failed. You got stuff like the Neo Geo and the Panasonic 3DO, the Philips CDI, the Amiga CD32. Oh boy, I can go on and on and on about like many different consoles. Specifically the 5th generation, right? People see it in their mind. They see it as only like, oh, the Sega Saturn versus the Nintendo 64 versus the PlayStation. So people think that generation only had 3 consoles. In reality, that generation had, I believe, a little over 9 consoles. But the other ones are just, they're just failures that nobody's heard about. Maybe the other one is like the Atari Jaguar, because I know the Angry Video Game Nerds, he kind of put a spotlight on that console, and that's, from this generation, from the N64 and PS1 era. But, other than that, people don't know about Apple making a console and just stuff like that, right? So, people thought this is going to be one of them, right? That, oh, this is going to fail. This is going to come out. Nobody's going to get it. But Sony did everything right. They strategized. They knew the thing about these consoles that made them fail was they're weirdly complicated to develop for. No games come out for it. The marketing is kind of, meh, stuff like that. So Sony worked on third-party deals. They had their first-party games. They made it very, very, very easy to develop for. And they did a strategy that nobody had ever done before, or at least, made it mainstream, which is they took an L. They took a loss in selling, on money and selling the hardware, but they made the money back selling accessories and the games and stuff like that. They basically give away the razor to sell you the blade. That's the philosophy that they use for this. And believe it or not, they still do it to this day. Sony always sells their consoles at a loss, but they make their money back through games and accessories and controllers and, I guess now subscription services, right? But yeah, another thing that the PlayStation did was basically a somewhat multimedia machine. This, on top of playing games, also played your CD musics. So if you have jewel cases of albums and discs, you can listen to them here, and it's pretty cool. Other thing that PlayStation did, that we celebrate a lot for, is they popularize. Like, when I mean they popularize video games into like the mainstream form, and also like they're not for kids. So back in the the 70s, the 80s, and 90s, stuff with the Atari, the Nintendo, the Super Nintendo, the Sega, Genesis, stuff like that, video games were seen as toys for kids, right? another means of like a kid to get entertainment for, right? Sure, some teenagers and some young adults, got into them, but it was more frowned upon. Oh, you're a nerd, you're an outcast, what the heck are you doing? But the PlayStation, dude, this made it cool. Now all the skater kids want to get a PlayStation. All the 19-year-olds, all the 21-year-olds, all the 26-year-olds, everybody wants a PlayStation. It's hardcore, it's edgy, it's hell yeah, but we get to play Tony Hawk and Twisted Metal on this bitch. So it made it mainstream. It is, I believe, no, I think, yeah, it is the very first console to ever break the 100 million barrier. Before this, none of the consoles had surpassed the NES, right? The NES was at 60 million, 61 million, and then every other console was always under it. Like the ones that came close were like the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis. I know the Atari 2600 was like around 30 million. The Genesis was like 35 million, something like that. The SNES was like 49 million. And then some, did horrible, that they barely even sold like 1 million. They flopped. But they would fluctuate, right? They would never beat the 61 million mark of the NES, right? Certain people, they let alone didn't think somebody would hit 100 million, right? But then this thing came out in the very first try, remind you of Sony, and they broke the barrier and they went into the stratosphere, into outer space. And let's say if hitting 100 million was like landing on the moon, then the PlayStation is Neil Armstrong, because they're the first ones to do it. Obviously, other consoles after that have surpassed 100 million, stuff like the Wii, the DS, the PS2, the PS4, a bunch of other of PlayStation's consoles, and Nintendo, but mostly Nintendo and PlayStation's, they have surpassed the 100 million, stuff like that. But yeah, it's the very first console on the very first try, which is like insane to think about. Because usually nobody gets it right the first time. Not even just in anything in life, you don't get it right the first time. And if you do, it's probably because you either got lucky or you prepared your ass off and you did all the studying before you got in your first rodeo, if you say it like that, right? So yeah, so they knew what they were doing, right? On top of that, we also have to give credit where credit is due. In terms of the fact that they kind of pushed, when I said that video games are into mainstream, they the CD player also pushed that, right? So it wasn't just solely like games. I'm sure like people looked at the multimedia aspect and be like, wow, it's a CD player, that makes it more interesting, right? But I like I've said this, and I had this take with the PS2, I highly doubt that 100 million people bought this just to play CDs on it. Like if we're really talking about it, I have a feeling only like 2 million people bought it just for a CD player. And kind of like how I say with the PS2, like I doubt 150 million people bought the PS2 just to watch DVDs on it. But I believe if you were to tell me maybe like the first 5 million people bought it just to watch DVDs, stuff like that, right? But the credits due on it being a CD player, and then every other console afterwards did it, right? The Sega Saturn is has a CD player on it. The Dreamcast, the PS2 and the PS3 and the Xbox, and the 360, and so on and so forth. So that's pretty cool. One thing I will say about the PlayStation is that if you ever want to get into it and collecting stuff like retro stuff, I would say go for the later models. And usually you can tell, for example, this you see here it says SCPH 9000. I believe the first models are like 5000, 5001, stuff like that. Those are the ones that the laser, since the laser's in a different spot, right? It's closer to the power supply. The laser goes out on those very fast. I would say go for the 7000, but more safely go for the SCPH 9000, because those are the more reliable ones. Usually the later models of a certain console are the more reliable ones. I mean, look at the 360, right? You don't want to get a first edition 360 because that thing's gonna red ring on you, right? You kind of want the slim and the later models of the 360. Just an example. So it's kind of like that, with these older consoles. especially these 30-year-old consoles, that the lasers, they haven't been renewed, the 30-year-old lasers that are probably like on the trail end. Because I know I've heard people they've had to like flip their PlayStation and put upside down, weird stuff, right? Also, this I believe was either the first or one of the first consoles to use memory cards, because since you use CDs, you can't save on the cartridge anymore, right? So you have to use memory cards. Here we have the Japanese one, which is the color is a little lighter than the North American one. The North American is a little darker gray. But yeah, it's pretty cool. Also, mention on CDs, it popularized using CDs. Back then, some consoles came out and they used cartridges, others use CDs. We were in this transitioning era where it felt like half of the consoles that would come out, they were either CDs or cartridges. Sony kind of just popularized it and just be like, okay, from now on we're using CDs, because every other company saw that, okay, CDs are cheaper to produce, they hold more storage, more data stored on it, and cartridges, they have, they're expensive to manufacture, and they don't hold as many memory. I believe CDs back during this era is around 700 megabytes. Meanwhile, a cartridge, at least let's say an Nintendo 64 cartridge, from the numbers that I've seen, the maximum was 32 megabytes. So as I compare 32 megabytes with 700 megabytes, yeah, it's a huge difference. On top of that, CDs, I believe, I legit think I've heard that it was like $1 just to make one. I may be wrong, but that's what I, from all of the research I've done and from stories I've heard from people older than me who lived through this era. Making CDs were like $1, $2, something like that. Meanwhile, manufacturing a cartridge is way more. So I'm sure companies are like, yeah, we're sticking for CDs from now on. So yeah, it's pretty cool. I mean, what else can I tell you guys other than, I would say, if you want to get into it, retro collecting, I would say, yeah, pick it up, check it out. I want to show you guys some games as well, because Sony did a good job at bringing in all the third-party games. It was to the point where companies like Capcom, Konami, Square Enix, they were mostly always exclusively putting games on like Nintendo, like on Super Nintendo, and then some on the Sega Genesis. But the PlayStation was just so popular and the CDs were just so attractive that a lot of them abandoned ship. Like Square Enix, after the Super Nintendo, they mostly just put games on PlayStation, right? For a long time. Capcom, they still put stuff on Nintendo and Sega, but it seemed that this was like their favorite platform to put stuff. Same thing with Konami. So yeah, a lot of them, because it's easier to develop for, and cheaper to make the discs and all that stuff, and the install base too. I mean, if you're a game developer, you kind of want to put your game on the console that everybody has, right? So I don't blame him for it. But yeah, I want to show you guys just some cool games if you guys are ever interested in picking up a PlayStation, or maybe a PS2 or a PS3, because those are backwards compatible with PS1 games. So if you want to get a PS2 or PS3 as well, hey, you could pop in a PS1, this can play on them perfectly fine. But yeah, the first one I'm gonna show you guys is Ape Escape. This is a first-party Sony game. It's a pretty cool game. It uses a DualShock. So what a DualShock is basically, it's the PlayStation controller, the one with the 2 analog sticks, because that one came out in '98, right? So halfway through its lifespan. In the first few years, the PlayStation, it was just like, think of it like a Super Nintendo controller, with like the handles on the side. That's basically what it was. But then after Sony seeing the analog stick being popularized on the Nintendo 64, and the Sega Saturn also came out with their analog 3D controller later on, Sony said, we'll put ones, but we'll do 2 analog sticks, and that's the standard that we use to this day. That use, you've known the PS2, the PS3, the PS4 controller, etc. So it's pretty cool. Oh yeah, one cool thing is I have this Japanese Tamagotchi game, right? And the game cases on these, I guess ignore this sort of reflective wrapper I have. They're different than the ones in North America. As you can see, here is like a big lettering of PlayStation with the logo. Here is just on the side. So it's pretty cool in the differences of the jewel cases and stuff like that. And I know in Europe it's like a big bold letter down here in black. It says PlayStation rather than on the side in North America or in Japan, which is just a little logo. So it's pretty cool, interesting. So I'll just show you some games, just why not. So maybe if you've never seen how PlayStation games look like in their jewel cases, is showing you. This is one of those cool games that uses the accessories. As you can see here, it uses the Pocket Station. Now, if you guys don't know what the Pocket Station is, here's maybe a better image right here of it. And then you got an old school phone. Pocket Station is basically just like a memory card, right? But it's like a little like a VMU from the Sega Dreamcast, or Tamagotchis. And then it also works as a memory card. So you pop it in, in the console like that. You open it in the memory card. And you can basically, for example, in Street Fighter, you could put in your character here, right? And let's say you gotta go like out or whatever, right? And in the car ride, let's say your mom or your dad is driving, you're sitting in the back seat. You could train your character on this, train it. You guys go do the store, the laundry, whatever. Come back and you pop it in, and then you transfer it to the console, and then your character, all the experience that you train, let's say while you were doing it in here, it goes to your character. Same thing with Final Fantasy VIII. I know you could feed and train your chocobos, if I'm not mistaken. You could do that as well. And it has many uses for other games, but the ones that was popularized and came with it was with Doko de Moisio, which is this little guy right here. That's the name of the game that he's from, right? He's called Toro. He's actually the mascot of PlayStation Japan. And you teach him stuff, you learn with him, you teach him how to live in society and stuff like that, basically, because he wants to become like a human at heart. And basically, when you're outside the game, when you're no longer playing the console, let's say you gotta like do other stuff, you basically continue the game here and you teach him stuff, and you interact with him, and it's pretty cool. You help him socialize with this, and then all the progress you make here, you pop it in back, and then he gains that XP or that progress, which is super cool, right? And these are just more of his games right here. I have a whole collection of them. It's unfortunate he only came out in Japan. There's a cool picture of him in the bike. It would have been really cool to see this in America. Sure, I can play this in this Japanese PS1, but the text is all in Japanese, and my Japanese isn't, it's nowhere near. I can't read Japanese at all, only like a few words. But it's nowhere near for me to play the entire game since it's Japanese text. But yeah, it's pretty cool. We have other first party games like Parappa the Rapper. It's pretty cool. I believe this is when Sony was a lot of their first party games were very creative. And the trend still went on the PS2 and the PS3 of them having unique and creative first party games. It was until PS4 where they forgot about the other ones and they just focused on like action adventure, third person games. And I feel like that's what every PlayStation game is nowadays. But I do miss when they were like, cool, like quirky, unique, creative stuff like this. Or, during the PS2 era, we had stuff like, Eco, Shadow of the Colossus, Sly Cooper, and in the PS3, obviously stuff like Little Big Planet. So I do miss all this era of PlayStation. This is probably the game that popularized, or one of the games that helped popularize the PlayStation, along with games like Twisted Metal, Final Fantasy VII. This is what basically made JRPGs popular in America, because before that it was like niche. Some people play Chrono Trigger on SNES or Final Fantasy VI, but they weren't popular. This, after JRPGs were cool in America, and it was thanks to the PlayStation and hell, they even published it here in America. As you can see, the Sony Interactive logo, or the Sony Computer Entertainment logo. And then I guess the last game I get to show you guys is Gran Turismo. And I guess you can include Gran Turismo 2 in this. I have Gran Turismo 2 somewhere in there. I don't feel like digging through my shelf to find it. But yeah, Gran Turismo, the whole arcade racing, simulating racing, because I know there are two modes, right? This is a simulator racing, but I know it also has arcade mode for those who like to play arcade racers. This is, I believe, one of the games, if not the game, that popularized simulation racing games, and this is by far the best selling game on PlayStation. I believe is 10, 12 million copies. I forget. I should have done more research right before doing this video. But yeah, the best selling game is this one, and then Gran Turismo 2 and Final Fantasy 7 are right behind it. But yeah, it's just one of the games that made it mainstream, and to the point where in pop culture, everybody talk about PlayStation. You know, and it went on until like the late 90s and the 2000s, and stuff like that. Sony supported this console for 12 years, believe it or not, right? The last PlayStation game to ever come out was FIFA 2005, and Sony stopped manufacturing PlayStation 1s, I believe, in early 2006. So yeah, 12 years in the market. Sony's always been very good at supporting their consoles long term. And yeah, and it's crazy how all this came up, all this console and everything. Sony and the PlayStation brand. It's crazy how it would have not existed if it wasn't for the whole deal with them and Nintendo falling apart, which is crazy. For those of you guys that don't know, the PlayStation exists because Ken Kutaragi, he was a Sony employee back at the time. He was playing, I believe he was playing either Mario, or he was playing like the NES or the Famicom in Japan with his daughter. But he's like, wow, these songs in the games are kind of good, but the sound chip on this is horrible. So it kind of like kills it, right? So then he worked with Nintendo to make the sound effects chip, the sound chip, excuse me, on the Super Nintendo, and that's what the Super Nintendo sounds fucking amazing, because Sony made the sound chip for that console. And then through that relationship, Nintendo and Sony were on good terms, and then Sony they proposed, hey man, we should make a CD add-on because CDs are gonna be the future, for your Super Nintendo. Nintendo said yes. But then Nintendo didn't like the terms after, and this is after they signed the contract. They kind of regretted it. They got cold feet. They didn't like the terms of the contract and they wanted to back out. But Sony was like, hey man, you already signed it. Plus, we kind of already like made the thing, and the CES, the Consumer Electronics Show of 1981, was in a day or two. So they're like, yeah, no, I mean, we kind of made we kind of made the device already and all this stuff, and we're about to show it in 2 days. So then Nintendo, behind Sony's back, they made a deal with Philips, right? And Philips is, is one of the competitors of Sony. So, not only backstabbing and betraying Sony, Nintendo betraying Sony, they went with their competitor, with their ops. So then, Sony goes on stage, right, at CES 1991. They show off the CD add-on, right, and the new console, and it was called a Nintendo PlayStation, right, and it is basically a Nintendo console that plays CDs and the Super Nintendo games, right, and it was their co-creation, right, their collab. And then after that, the crowd likes it, whatever. The next day, right, day 2 of the convention or the show or whatever, Nintendo shows up and it says, hey, we're working on the CD add-on, right, blah blah blah, stuff like that. And our partners are, and then they're like, oh shit, is it PlayStation? And then they say, nope, our partners are Philips, and we're making it, with the Philips CDI or whatever. And Sony employees, the Sony executives and the Sony employees in the crowd, they were furious. They were mad. They were like, what the hell is this? We were working together, and you guys violated the contract and worked it with somebody else. So then after that, the whole thing got canceled, right, or whatever. But then Ken Kutaragi, the guy who made the sound chip for the Super Nintendo, he went to his boss at PlayStation and says, hey, we need to make this console, man. Screw it. We gotta like put these motherfuckers down, right? Nintendo, we can't take this ass beating like a bitch, basically. So then the head Sony CEO said, you know what, do it, just let's just make our own console and let's just destroy Nintendo. And that's how the birth of the PlayStation happened. And guess what, it did destroy Nintendo, because this went on to sell 101 million units, and the Nintendo 64 only did 30 million. And then they did it again with the PS2. The PS2 went on to sell 160 million. Meanwhile, the GameCube only sold like 21 million. So, and ever since then, ever since then, after that, like with the Wii and the Switch, Nintendo has caught up as well. And the PS3, PS4, PS5 are doing amazing, or within their respective generations. But for the first few while, Sony was kicking Nintendo's ass. Now it's more even. I mean, you got stuff like the PS4 and the Switch and the PS5. They're all doing amazing. But yeah, it's crazy. With that betrayal, Nintendo created their biggest rival. People, especially 90s kids, they want to tell you Nintendo's biggest rival was Sega. It really wasn't. Like if it wasn't for the Genesis, like the only time Sega put up a fight was with Genesis. Any other consoles, Nintendo kicked Sega's ass. Nintendo's true main rival, their biggest, most fierce competitor, is PlayStation. But 90s kids don't want to tell you that, especially like Adam Corey. Like, don't tell Adam Corey like that, because then he hates the PlayStation brand, so he's probably gonna be like, Sega. But anyways, other than that, guys, what do you guys think of the PlayStation 30th anniversary? I say start collecting for it if you're interested in it. It's a lot of cool games out there. Maybe you haven't played it, or maybe just collect the games. If you want to, if let's say you have a PS3 or PS2 lying around and you don't want to get the console, get the games and pop them in your PS2 or PS3 and enjoy them through there. But yeah, other than that, guys, thank you guys for watching. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe, as I really appreciate it. And have a good day, guys.